So this is our sort of random collective of presentations we've decided. So we are on a couple of different pieces today, and that's okay because for me this presentation is sort of a project that's been sort of, well, sitting in a Google document for about 2 years now with my colleague Amar Kode at the University of Manitoba, and it's a project that we're interested in, and yet we haven't really sort of pursued it. And so this is sort of the conceptual framing of that piece and sort of some indications of the data we have to sort of maybe stir up further ideas, so sort of feedback on it. And also it was the closest thing to technology I could think of with Tom's conference theme for today. So the idea of this paper is this concept of celebrity refugees. And when you think about celebrity refugees, or if you Google celebrity refugees, you can actually see a lot of information on various people who came to Canada or the US or to Europe as refugees at one time or another. And so you have examples of former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Albert Einstein, Marlene Dietrich, Sigmund Freud, Hannah Arendt, some of the classic examples. And usually these examples are sort of pulled out to say refugees aren't drains on society, refugees aren't a pull that we just have to take for this humanitarian moment. They're contributors, they're brilliant leaders, and also, I was giving a paper on refugees and terrorism yesterday, they're not to be feared. So those sort of dual reasons to look at the sort of celebrity refugees as they're not necessarily drains on society and they're not to be feared, that they're people that we assume can be successful. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has a profile of 20 such prominent refugees, as they call them. But those aren't actually the individuals that we are talking about, my colleague Amar and I, when we talk about this idea of celebrity refugee. It's not this global level of celebrity. Rather, what we mean by celebrity is this sort of repetitive human interest focus on particular newly arrived refugees that's captured extended media attention, particularly since the change of government, the Syrian resettlement promise, and the hashtag welcome refugees that the government put forward with their Syrian resettlement program. So in Winnipeg, where I live and work, there have been handfuls of stories on an individual by the name of Yahya Samatar. And Yahya is a Somali man who sort of gained attention in Manitoba when he swam across the river from the US to claim refugee status with literally nothing but the clothes he was wearing, and arrived soaked in Emerson to claim refugee status. Yahya is particularly articulate and comfortable in English, and he's become a real sort of advocate and go-to speaker for the media. This is sort of a link to a piece on DNTO, who did several different interviews with him. On their website you can see a whole tracing of his entire journey up through South America, through the United States and into Manitoba, and they refer to him as a rock star refugee. So Yahya was one of the individuals that I've spoken to multiple times that sort of triggered this research. The other individual who sort of sparked this for me is a graduate of my own law school, Kobra Rahimi. Kobra came to Canada in 2001 as a refugee with her family, having grown up in a refugee camp, taught herself English, and graduated from Robson Hall Law School last year. So Kobra is another person who has gained increasing media attention as she's become articulate in her voice for refugee advocacy because of her own success. And conversations with both Kobra and Yahya really sort of stimulated this question on why they're going to the media, why they're agreeing for all these conversations, all these interviews, and also what else they want out of life that has nothing to do with their refugee status, that past history as coming to Canada as a refugee. So that's sort of the starting piece of it. And then there's this sort of question of why this is important. So I've pulled up a few media headlines recently, and this connection between the idea of refugee protection and public support. So whether polls, whether stats show that the Canadian public is in support of refugee protection or not. And this plays out on a lot of different levels in terms of how we actually pursue protection in Canada. So it plays out in the government decision-making on the targets they set for how many refugee claimants they're going to process each year, for how many resettlement refugees they're going to accept. It plays out on government policy on the border, how they approach the Safe Third Country Agreement, what they're doing with it. And it plays out on this question of irregular arrivals and the government's choice right now not to designate those irregular arrivals as designated foreign nationals, with significant consequences to how they're processed as refugees. So it plays out in all these levels. It also plays out in terms of the public understanding of refugee need for protection, the public understanding of the support for it. And in Canada, that plays out particularly because we have this model of refugee protection through private sponsorship. And so I'll get back to that at the end, the sort of how it affects you and me and people we know in our direct ability to then go and sponsor refugees. So really all of these things are circling in the minds of people like Cobra and Yaya when they decide to go to the media, when they agree to give talks, when they agree to continually tell their narratives, both of the trauma that caused them to claim refugee status and their success upon arrival in Canada. And so those two presentations of who they are. And so the project that I'm working on is really looking at unpacking this media attention on these particular refugees to sort of take it in a sort of problematic viewpoint of this connection to our need to have this public profile of these refugees. So as a starting point, what we did was we had a student do a media survey through the Canadian media coverage from November 2015 to November 2016. As I said, this project's a little dated. So the first year of the Syrian resettlement to Canada, using the Canadian Major Dailies database on ProQuest. And we had a couple of different search terms related to refugees and family. And one of the things that sort of stalled us on our research is the massive number of media results that we got from that. But what we're doing from that is we're extracting who are the refugees who have had multiple interviews, who've done what refugee families across Canada have really been profiled in different media institutions more than 5 or 6 times, depending on the numbers. We'll see how many we extract, for then more of a qualitative data analysis to sort of feed into this questioning. But at this point, we've left that data relatively unanalyzed. So what I want to talk about more is simply the framing of this conceptual piece in a little bit more detail. So previous research and previous refugee flows into Canada has been on this sort of media focus on the discourse surrounding migrant arrivals, how much coverage covered those arrivals, the imagery, whether it was positive or negative, on those migrant arrivals, and really that relationship between public opinion and media coverage in one frame or another. What we're trying to do with this project is a little bit different. What we're looking here is really on that relationship between media and law. So that place of law in all of this, in that retelling of trauma that the law primarily requires of refugees to start with, and in connection to what then qualifies or defines their settlement success in Canada, and then on the opposite side of that, the pull of death. So the idea of the dead migrant, the unsuccessful refugee who didn't arrive here, and how that plays against these successful portrayals. So really, what we're talking about, and I titled it The Retelling of Trauma. But before there's a retelling of trauma, there's initial telling of trauma, and that's the original telling that the law requires. And I'm sensitive to this because this used to be my job in Delhi. I used to do the interviews, tell me your story, why should I give you mandate status? Tell me your story that you told 20 years ago, why should I give you a resettlement referral? Tell me your story, and let's put that story in a legal framework. Let's do that. And refugees for resettlement need to do this, and refugees in Canada need to do this as well, and they do it multiple times. Even for that legal telling to get that refugee status, they initially have to do a basis of claim form. They need to set that structure. Then they have to go in front of a member of the Immigration and Refugee Board and retell this. And that narration that's required of them, of their sort of deepest, darkest, most horrifying moments, is what is necessary and required by the law to get their status, to get the protection, to be safe, to have a new home. And so that's the law. And I've been looking a lot at the sort of theoretical basis of that analysis, that original telling, and how that plays out and what's required of it. But then the interesting thing here is once they get that status, once they're then permanent residents in Canada by way of an asylum claim or by way of resettlement, that's not the end of that telling. what we're seeing is these refugees, who are now simply permanent residents of Canada, being asked to retell that story again and again and again. And yet at the same time that they're being asked to retell that story, they're being asked to tell a separate story. And that separate story is the story of their successful integration into Canada at the same time. So what you really have with these individuals is this forced dual existence. You have this idea that they're both successfully recognized as refugees, but they must relive this trauma in continued reincarnations to essentially justify and explain to the Canadian public, to gain public support, their belonging, their necessity, their reason for being in this new host state. And then on the other side of it, they have to show why they're deserving. And I'm not sure deserving is the right word here. I'm still struggling for this, but why we should want them here, why it's okay to have them here, that they're not simply coming and again that sort of idea of drain or risk, but that they are integrating. And they're not just integrating. These children aren't just succeeding, but the sort of scrutiny of their success, their role and behavior in how they're succeeding in the successful integration into Canada. And so the next part of this is looking at those images of success, what they are doing. So with Yaya, there have been interviews on his first snowfall in Winnipeg. There have been interviews on his first Jets game, his first job. Every event in his life becomes a media story. With Cobra, it's been law school, and the questioning of, does this mean she needs to do refugee law afterwards? Absolutely not. That idea that she's just simply a Canadian graduate of a law school and that past history defining who she is as she moves forward. Western Sydney University in 2015 put out a recruitment video on YouTube featuring a Sudanese child soldier turned human rights advocate following his law degree at Western Sydney University. And they had a couple other profiles, and the war child individual had millions more clicks on the YouTube video than their other claims. So again, this sort of transference of this personality from that back history. And again, even as a human rights lawyer in Australia then, that need to still hold on to this past identity that really, from a legal perspective, has now been surpassed. And so all of this puts more scrutiny on these refugees, and sometimes I think of this in terms of myself and my husband who dropped out of his master's and I'm ready to kill him, but that no one else judges him on that, aside from me. Or my children and how they're succeeding in school, or any of that. But it also makes me think of the other refugees I know in Winnipeg, the other people I talk to regularly who aren't at that level of success, who are barely coping, who barely speak English, who are scared to leave their homes, and many of whom, other than the sort of hiccup of Syrians who had it relieved, are being hurdled with huge transportation loans that they're being repaid. So this idea of high-level Canadian success is nowhere near what they're trying to mark, and yet that's what the media portrayals are showing to them. And part of this, so that's the question of representation. But the other interesting thing, in particular with the Syrian refugees, and this is sort of the researcher in me questioning this, is in partnership with Immigration and Refugee Citizenship and Refugees Canada and SSHRC, there was a rapid response targeted research agenda for Syrian refugees. So what you have across Canada is you have all these social scientists doing targeted research on Syrian refugees, and most of that is on their integration into Canada. So starting to trickle in now, and increasingly we're going to have all this data, all these studies. Overwhelming positioning is that a dead refugee, the failed refugee, is actually the most powerful pull for the protection of other refugees than those successful media representations of those successfully well-integrated refugees. And what do we do with that? How do we balance those? So those are sort of theoretical, conceptual bases of what we're trying to explore with this paper, and I really, with 10 seconds left to go, look forward to any questions or comments moving forward. Thank you.